By the time she got home, she was exhausted, her clothes damp, her heart pounding with unease. She sat on the edge of her bed staring at her phone, half expecting another message. None came, but the silence somehow felt worse. She barely slept that night, her mind spinning with questions. Who could it be? A jealous colleague? Someone from Jackson's past? The next morning, she walked into the office pale but determined. Jackson noticed immediately. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said, his tone sharp. "What's going on?" Emma hesitated. For a second, she thought about lying, but something in his expression stopped her. "Someone sent me messages last night," she said quietly. "They said I don't belong here, that I should stay away from you." For the first time since she'd met him, Jackson's mask cracked. His eyes darkened, his jaw tensed. "Who?" he demanded. "Show me." She handed him the phone, but the messages were gone. She had deleted them in panic. "They're not there," she whispered. "But I swear, I believe you," he said, cutting her off, his voice low, dangerous. "And whoever did this made a very big mistake." He took a deep breath, visibly forcing his anger under control. "You're not leaving this company, Emma. You're not running away because of a coward hiding behind a phone." She stared at him, surprised by his intensity. "You can't control everything," she said softly. "You can't fix this." His eyes locked on hers, and for a moment the room seemed to fall silent around them. "Watch me," he said. And in that moment, Emma realized two things. That Jackson Pierce was not a man who backed down from threats, and that, whether she wanted it or not, her life had become entangled with his. Whatever was coming next was no longer just business. It was personal. The rain had begun again by the time Emma found herself standing in the glass corridor that overlooked the city. The entire floor of Jackson's tower was quiet, the silence punctuated only by the low hum of the ventilation and the soft hiss of water streaming down the windows. She felt suspended between two worlds, the ordinary one outside, full of people who would never understand what she had just seen in the hidden facility below, and this one, where every surface glowed with mystery and the air itself seemed to vibrate with unspoken purpose. She could still feel the echo of Jackson's voice in her chest, that calm authority that both reassured and unsettled her. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he carried an ocean of meaning behind every word, as if he were constantly weighing what could be revealed and what must remain buried. When he appeared behind her, his reflection slid into the window beside her own, tall and sharp-edged, the city lights catching on the fine lines of his face. "You shouldn't be up here alone," he said softly. "The security systems reset at midnight." She didn't move, didn't answer, because she couldn't quite tell if he was worried about her safety or about what she might discover if she kept wandering. "It's fine," she murmured finally, her voice small but steady. "I just needed to breathe." Jackson stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the faint trace of his cologne, something understated, expensive, like cedar and storm air. "You saw more than I planned for you to see," he said, "and you handled it better than most people would." Emma turned her head then, looking at him not as her employer, but as a man who had just admitted to having secrets he rarely shared. "What are you really doing down there?" she asked. "That place didn't look like any research lab I've ever seen." Jackson hesitated. The light from the window carved his profile into something almost sculptural, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then he exhaled as though the silence itself had weight. "The facility was built long before you joined the company," he said. "It's a legacy project. My father started it, and I've been trying to finish what he couldn't." His tone was even, but there was a fracture under it, a tension that made Emma step closer without realizing. "Your father?" she repeated. "I thought he died when you were young." Jackson gave a short, humorless laugh. "He did, but he left me a blueprint for something that shouldn't exist, a system designed to map human potential. Every employee you've seen here, every algorithm, every piece of technology in this building, it's all connected to that idea." He paused, his eyes darkening, and it destroyed him. Emma felt a chill roll down her spine. "Destroyed him how?" she asked quietly. Jackson walked toward the window, resting a hand against the glass as though he could steady the world outside. "He believed he could quantify empathy," he said. "That if we could measure compassion, ambition, pain, all of it, we could build machines that truly understood us. But the more he tried, the more detached he became. When he died, there were rumors he'd erased parts of his own mind to prove a point. Jackson turned back to her then, his expression unreadable. "I've been trying to put back what he broke." The words hung between them like static. Emma wanted to respond, to tell him that no one could repair something so human with numbers, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He wasn't a man chasing profit. He was a son haunted by inheritance. She saw maybe for the first time the exhaustion in the careful way he moved, the way he spoke as though every truth cost him something. "That's why you built the lab," she said finally. "Not for power, for redemption." Jackson's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. "It's strange hearing that from someone who barely knows me," he said. "But maybe you see more than most." A quiet thunder rolled outside, and for a moment the whole floor flickered in pale light. Emma felt a sudden impulse to reach out, to touch the man who seemed at once unshakable and completely lost. Instead, she folded her arms, holding the tremor inside her chest. "You hide behind your brilliance," she said. "But underneath, you're just trying to make peace with something that broke you." Jackson looked at her then, really looked, and something changed. His voice, when it came, was low and rough. "I'm not sure peace is possible anymore. But when you walked into this company, you reminded me what it looked like." Emma froze. She hadn't expected that. In his words, there was no flirtation, no manipulation, just an admission that felt heavier than any confession. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. And for a long moment, they simply stood together in the dim blue light, two people bound by silence and the ghosts of their pasts. Finally, Jackson broke the spell. "You should go home," he said softly. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be different." But she could tell by the way he lingered that he didn't really want her to leave. When she finally stepped into the elevator, she turned to see him still standing there, hands in his pockets, his gaze following her until the doors slid shut. The descent felt endless. The air hummed around her, and in the mirrored wall she saw her own reflection, wide-eyed, shaken, alive. Something inside her had shifted. She had come here to build a career, to prove herself in a world that dismissed her too easily. But now she was caught in something larger, a story about legacy, loss, and the thin, dangerous thread of connection that ran between two lonely hearts. That night, as she walked through the quiet streets toward her apartment, the rain washed over her hair and face, cold and cleansing, yet all she could feel was the warmth of his voice still echoing inside her. The strange comfort of knowing that beneath all his walls, Jackson Pierce was just a man trying to fix what love had broken. She didn't know where this revelation would lead them, only that it had already begun to change everything. Morning crept through the city like a slow breath, golden light spilling between towers of steel and glass. Emma stood at her kitchen counter with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, staring at nothing. The night before felt like a dream she hadn't quite woken from. Every word Jackson had said kept replaying in her head, the confession of a man who lived with ghosts. She had wanted to believe she understood him, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized how little anyone truly knew. The news feeds were full of stories about Pierce Industries, new innovations, record profits, the image of a flawless empire. But behind that facade was something fragile, something that trembled just beneath the surface, and she could feel it now, in the way her own heart beat faster when she thought of him. She told herself it was just empathy, admiration for a man driven by impossible burdens. Yet even as she whispered that lie, she knew there was more. By the time she reached the office, the air carried a quiet tension. The building seemed too still, as if everyone sensed a shift in gravity. When she entered Jackson's floor, she found him standing by the same glass wall where they had spoken the night before. His jacket hung on the back of a chair. He looked tired, stripped of his usual armor of precision. For a moment she almost turned around, afraid of what might spill from the silence between them. But then he turned, and the look in his eyes, calm, steady, threaded with recognition, drew her forward before she could think. "I didn't expect you this early," he said. His voice carried that faint rasp she had noticed only when he was exhausted. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, setting her bag down. "Your words kept echoing in my head." He gave a short, sad smile. "That happens to people who get too close to my world." For a long moment neither spoke. The forest hummed, the ruin pulsed, and the rain began again softly like 1,000 whispers. Emma stepped forward, closing the distance, her fear dissolving into something deeper, a certainty that whatever he was, whatever he carried, it had led her here for a reason. She touched his hand, ignoring the faint heat that surged beneath his skin. "Then let me stay," she said simply. If I was meant to find you, then let me be part of this. The words broke something open in him. The tension in his shoulders faltered. He exhaled. The glow dimmed, and for the first time his eyes softened completely. Thunder rolled again, farther away this time, and the forest's grip loosened. Jackson sank to his knees, the glow fading as if the storm itself was releasing him. Emma knelt beside him, her hands steady on his shoulders, grounding him as the trembling stopped. Around them, the ancient ruin seemed to quiet, the carvings dimming into stillness. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. You don't understand what you've just bound yourself to. Emma met his gaze and answered, Maybe not yet, but I will. He laughed then, softly, painfully, as if her words both healed and hurt him. The storm outside the clearing began to fade into gentle rain, and for the first time the forest didn't feel hostile. The ruin stood silent, its purpose unknown but no longer threatening. They sat there for what felt like hours, saying nothing, until the light began to change and the clouds thinned enough for the first weak rays of dusk to fall across the ground. Jackson finally looked at her again, and there was something like peace in his expression. It's starting, he said quietly, and once it begins, there's no turning back. Emma didn't flinch. Then let it, she said, and in that moment, as the last echoes of thunder faded and the air shimmered with the promise of something vast and unseen, she knew that whatever Jackson was, whatever force moved through him, had chosen her as its witness and maybe its counterpart. The storm had passed, but destiny had just begun to unfold. The soft hum of the elevator faded into silence as the doors slid open, revealing a vast space unlike anything Emma Harris had ever seen. The air itself felt different down here, cooler, charged, as if humming with invisible energy. Her heels clicked softly against the polished concrete floor as she stepped out, her eyes widening in quiet awe. It wasn't an office in the traditional sense. It was a living experiment. Expansive glass panels divided sections of the space, but the transparency gave it an almost dreamlike continuity, where art, science, and design seemed to coexist without barriers. At one end of the room, sleek white desks held holographic prototypes and digital blueprints. At the other, curved walls displayed immersive simulations of workplaces, interactive, dynamic, breathing environments that responded to touch and voice. Emma's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just design. This was the future. Jackson Pierce stood a few feet behind her, hands in his pockets, watching her reaction with the quiet satisfaction of a man who rarely surprised people anymore. He didn't speak immediately, allowing her to absorb the space in silence. What is this place? She finally asked, her voice low, reverent, as if afraid to disturb the atmosphere around her. It's beautiful, she added almost to herself. It's a prototype, Jackson replied, his tone calm but threaded with a quiet pride. We call it the Nexus, a workspace that adapts to human behavior instead of forcing humans to adapt to space. Light, air, sound, temperature, all responsive. The environment learns from the people who inhabit it. Every movement, every pattern, becomes data that improves productivity without suffocating creativity. He took a few slow steps closer, stopping beside her. It's what we plan for the future of all Pierce Industries facilities, starting with New York. I wanted you to see it, to feel it. Emma turned toward him, her eyes reflecting the soft blue glow of the holographic panels. It's extraordinary, she said, her voice almost trembling with admiration. But also, she hesitated. It's intimidating. Spaces like this, perfect, intelligent, they almost erase the human touch. It's breathtaking, yes, but also a little... She searched for the word. Lonely. Jackson's gaze lingered on her for a moment, studying her expression as though she were part of the experiment. Lonely, he repeated quietly as if testing the word on his tongue. Most people see innovation. You see isolation. I see both, she replied softly. Progress is wonderful, but not if it forgets the people it's meant to serve. You can make everything smarter, faster, more efficient, but if it loses warmth, connection, or meaning, it stops being human. Her words hung in the air like a slow echo. Jackson didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned toward one of the glass walls, watching the data flow like waves across the surface. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, contemplative. My father used to say something similar, he murmured. He was an architect before he built Pierce Industries. He said design isn't about walls or furniture. It's about how people feel when they exist within a space. Emma's curiosity flickered. Your father was an architect? He was everything I wasn't, Jackson said simply. His tone caught between nostalgia and regret. Creative, patient, he designed homes, not corporations. He used to bring me to his projects when I was a kid. I remember watching him sketch by hand for hours, every line deliberate, every detail telling a story. But when he died, the company shifted. I shifted. I took what he built and made it bigger, stronger, but I've always wondered if I also made it colder. He turned toward her then, and for the first time since she met him, his expression wasn't composed or confident, it was vulnerable. Emma studied him, caught off guard by the honesty in his voice. For a man whose image screamed control, wealth, and power, that brief glimpse of uncertainty made him more human than any headline ever could. Maybe you didn't make it colder, she said gently. Maybe you just built what the world demanded of you. And maybe this, she gestured around at the nexus, is your way of finding balance again. Jackson's lips curved slightly, an almost smile. You read people well, Ms. Harris. I designed for them, she replied. You have to understand what drives people, what scares them, what comforts them, if you want to build something that truly connects. He stepped closer, the faint scent of his cologne. Woody, understated, expensive, drifting between them. That's what sets you apart, he said quietly. Most designers see spaces. You see stories. Her heart stuttered slightly at the way he said it, the low timbre of his voice stirring something she hadn't expected. She forced herself to step back, steadying her tone. Well, stories are what make spaces live, she said. Otherwise, we're just arranging furniture in empty rooms. He smiled faintly, but his gaze remained steady, assessing. Tell me, Emma, he said, his voice soft but deliberate. If you were to redesign this space, the Nexus, what would you change? The question took her by surprise. Change? She repeated, glancing around. It's already flawless. Perfection, Jackson said, is the enemy of innovation. So what would you change? Emma hesitated, walking slowly through the room, her heels clicking in measured rhythm. She trailed her fingers lightly along the edge of a sleek white table that seemed to float above the floor. It feels too calculated, she said after a moment. Every line, every surface, every light, it's intelligent, but it doesn't breathe. I'd add imperfection, something organic, something unexpected, a curve where there's only straight edges, textures that tell stories, materials that age with time instead of resisting it. Because people do age, and they need spaces that grow with them, not against them. Jackson watched her as she spoke, his expression unreadable but intent. When she finally turned back toward him, he said simply, You talk like an artist, not a corporate designer. I didn't study business, she said with a faint smile. I studied emotion, and emotion doesn't fit neatly into floor plans. There was a long pause, the kind that felt charged rather than awkward. The city lights flickered through the glass walls, casting golden reflections across the polished floors. Jackson took a step forward, his voice low. You remind me of something I used to be, he said, before the world demanded that I become something else. Emma felt a strange ache in her chest, a flicker of recognition she didn't want to acknowledge. She met his eyes and saw something there she hadn't expected, loneliness sharp and familiar. For a moment, the CEO and the designer disappeared, and all that remained were two people standing in a room filled with echoes of what they'd both lost somewhere along the way. She swallowed, breaking the silence. Maybe that's why you brought me here, she said softly. Not just to show me what your company is building, but to see if there's still something human left in it. He didn't deny it. Instead, he walked toward a console and pressed a hidden switch. The room shifted subtly but dramatically. The lights dimmed, the ambient hum softened, and panels along the walls transformed into projections of forests, oceans, skies, all alive, immersive, surrounding them in nature's rhythm. Do you still think it feels lonely? He asked. Emma turned in slow astonishment, the images washing over her like a dream. No, she whispered. Now it feels alive. That's the goal, Jackson said quietly. To make the future feel alive again. The moment stretched, intimate, unspoken, suspended between professional admiration and something dangerously close to connection. Emma felt her pulse quicken and she forced herself to look away, grounding her thoughts. This could change everything, she said, her voice firming. Not just for your company, but for how people think about workspaces. If we merge human warmth with this level of innovation, You won't just build offices. You'll build legacies. Jackson's gaze softened. And if I asked you to help me do that, to lead the design with full creative control, would you? Emma froze, caught between excitement and fear. Are you offering me the project? I'm offering you a challenge, he said simply. One that could define your career. But it comes with expectations. It won't be easy. I don't do easy, she said, meeting his gaze steadily. Something in his expression shifted. Respect, maybe, or intrigue. Then we understand each other, he said. They stood there, the city stretching out beneath them, the night pressing softly against the glass, two people unknowingly stepping into something that would alter both their paths. For Emma, it was the beginning of a test of courage, creativity, and heart. For Jackson, it was the first time in years that he felt something other than the cold satisfaction of success. He didn't know if it was curiosity, admiration, or the start of something far more dangerous. When she finally left the building that night, the air outside felt charged, the way it does after a storm. She walked through the Chicago streets, the city lights shimmering on the river below, her mind spinning with everything that had happened. She had come here to pitch a project and ended up standing on the edge of something she couldn't yet name. Back in his office, Jackson stood alone before the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city that had built him and broken him. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about profit margins or expansion plans. He was thinking about her, the woman who had walked into his world uninvited and somehow reminded him that even the most intelligent structures needed a heart to sustain them. Neither of them knew it yet. But what began as a pretend kiss would soon become the most real test of trust, ambition, and redemption either of them had ever faced. When Emma's eyes fluttered open, the first thing she noticed was silence. Not the usual mechanical hum of office machines or the steady rhythm of keyboards tapping in the distance, but a profound, velvety quiet that seemed to wrap around her. Her head felt heavy, her breathing slow, and it took her several seconds to remember where she was. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung faintly in the air, blending with something softer, cologne, warm and faintly woodsy. Her eyes adjusted to the low golden light filtering through a glass panel, and she realized she wasn't in the main office anymore. The walls were sleek and gray, with a single abstract painting above a side table. A soft wool blanket covered her, and beneath it the sheets were cool and impossibly smooth. For a moment she wondered if she had died and awakened somewhere else entirely. Then she saw him. Jackson Pierce sitting in a chair beside her bed, jacket off, tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up to the forearms. His expression was unreadable, a rare mix of fatigue and focus, like someone who had been sitting there for hours and still refused to leave. Emma tried to speak, but her voice came out weak and dry. What happened? Jackson stood immediately, moving closer, his eyes scanning her face as though making sure she was really awake. You fainted, he said, his tone lower than usual, stripped of its command. You've been out for a while. The doctor said it was exhaustion. She blinked slowly, trying to remember. The lab, the weight of the machinery. His words, the darkness that closed in when she tried to stand. Everything came back in fragments. I'm sorry, she murmured, turning her face toward the ceiling. I didn't mean to cause. He cut her off gently, his voice firmer now. You don't have to apologize for being human. There was a long pause, the kind of silence that feels both comforting and suffocating. Emma's gaze drifted toward him. He looked different like this. Not the perfectly poised executive she saw in boardrooms, but tired, softer somehow. The top button of his shirt was undone, his hair slightly out of place. For the first time since she'd met him, he didn't look untouchable. He looked real. You stayed? She asked after a moment, her voice uncertain. Jackson gave a short breath of something that wasn't quite laughter. Of course I did, he said simply. You passed out in my building. I wasn't going to just leave. He didn't add that he had canceled 2 high-level investor calls, or that he had personally carried her from the lab to this private recovery room. She didn't need to know that. He wasn't sure why he'd done it himself. It had been instinctive, automatic, almost protective. Emma sat up slowly, pressing her fingers to her temples. I'm fine now, she said, but even she could hear how unconvincing that sounded. Jackson didn't reply. He turned away, walked to the small counter in the corner, and poured her a glass of water from a carafe. His movements were precise, controlled, like a man trying to restrain emotions that had no place in the corporate world. He handed her the glass. Their fingers brushed just briefly, but it was enough to send a shiver of awareness through her. She looked down, pretending not to notice, though the warmth lingered on her skin long after he stepped back. "Why did you show me that place?" she asked quietly, remembering the underground lab, the strange energy of it, the look on his face when he talked about control. Jackson didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the city skyline beyond the glass wall, where dawn was beginning to lift the darkness. "Because you're not like them," he said finally. "You see things differently. Everyone else in that room was watching numbers. You were watching meaning?" His voice dropped slightly, softer now. "That's rare here." Emma frowned, unsure how to respond. "I'm not sure what that means." "It means you still care," he said. "And that makes you a risk." The weight of his words settled between them, heavy and unspoken. A risk. That was how he saw her. A disruption in a world that thrived on perfection and obedience. Yet instead of feeling insulted, Emma felt something else entirely. Curiosity. Why would a man like Jackson Pierce, cold, calculated, and famously detached, admit something like that? What did he see in her that no one else did? The following days passed in a strange blur of tension and unspoken words. Emma returned to her routine, but the air between her and Jackson had changed. He stopped sending orders through his assistant and began coming directly to her office instead, standing beside her desk while she worked, sometimes asking about design choices, sometimes saying nothing at all. His presence filled the space like gravity, impossible to ignore, calm yet commanding. She tried to keep her focus, but she could feel the eyes of others on her, the murmurs in the hallways whenever he left her office. "The boss has a new favorite," someone whispered one morning when she walked past. Another voice snickered. "She must be very talented, or very lucky." The gossip spread like wildfire, feeding on envy and curiosity. Emma tried to ignore it, but every whisper chipped at her composure. She didn't want special attention. She had worked too hard for her position to let anyone think she had earned it through anything but skill. Yet despite the discomfort, she couldn't bring herself to avoid Jackson. There was something about him, something she couldn't name, that drew her back every time. One late evening, long after most of the building had emptied, she was still at her desk reviewing a project proposal. The quiet was almost peaceful until the elevator doors opened with a soft chime. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. Jackson's footsteps had a rhythm she'd already memorized. He stopped beside her desk and placed a steaming cup of coffee next to her. "You're still here," he said, his tone more observation than question. "So are you," she replied, glancing up with a faint smile. "Should I assume the CEO of Pierce Dynamics personally delivers caffeine to his employees now?" He gave a small, dry smile, a rare thing from him. Only the ones who forget to eat dinner. Her amusement faded slightly as she studied his face. There was something unreadable in his expression, a weight that had nothing to do with work. "You don't have to look after me," she said softly. "I can take care of myself." He met her eyes, and for a moment she saw through the armor he wore, the loneliness, the exhaustion, the silent war he fought behind every success. "I know you can," he said, his voice quiet. "But sometimes, it's not about need, it's about choice." They worked in silence for the next hour, side by side, the glow from the monitors painting their faces in soft blue light. Occasionally their hands brushed when they reached for the same document, and each time neither spoke. The air between them thickened with something unspoken, a tension that wasn't hostility but something more delicate, dangerous, real. When she finally leaned back, stretching her arms, she caught him watching her. Not with the sharp, assessing gaze of a CEO, but with something almost protective. She held his gaze for a second too long before breaking it, her heart beating faster than it should have. The next morning, the whispers began again. Only this time, they were uglier. Emma heard them in the elevator, in the hallways, even in the cafeteria. Rumors that she and Jackson were involved, that her promotions were inevitable. Each word burned like acid under her skin. She kept her head down, determined to ignore it, until one afternoon she overheard two senior designers mocking her near the break room. "Must be nice to have the boss's attention," one said. "She'll be in management by next month," the other laughed. "She won't last that long. He'll move on just like he always does." Something inside her snapped. She didn't say anything, didn't confront them, but when she went back to her office, her hands were shaking. That evening, she left early for the first time in months. The city outside was washed in rain, neon lights bleeding into puddles on the street. She walked aimlessly, her thoughts a storm of frustration and sadness. She had worked hard for everything she had, every project, every late night, every breakthrough, and yet one rumor could erase all of it. She ended up by the river, watching the water reflect the city's cold lights. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown number. You don't belong in his world. The message froze her where she stood. Another one followed seconds later. If you stay, you'll regret it. Her pulse raced as she looked around, scanning the shadows. The street was empty except for the steady drizzle and the hum of distant traffic. She deleted the messages but couldn't shake the chill that crawled down her spine. She hesitated, then walked closer. You mean people who care, she said quietly. The line seemed to hang in the air between them, fragile but impossible to retract. Jackson's expression softened, and for a heartbeat she saw something raw flicker in his gaze, a loneliness that made her chest ache. He leaned back against the table behind him, the faint light outlining the sharp planes of his face. Caring is dangerous here, he said. In this place, everything you feel gets measured, analyzed, weaponized. Emma shook her head. You built that system, but you still believe in the people inside it. I saw that last night. He looked away, a muscle tightening in his jaw. Belief isn't the same as trust, he murmured. I can't afford to trust anyone. She took another step forward until only a few feet separated them. Then why did you tell me? She asked. Why let me see the truth? He drew a slow breath, eyes lowering to the floor before lifting back to hers. Because you remind me of what honesty feels like. You walk through this building as if the walls aren't made to intimidate you. You look at me like I'm human, not a myth people built in their heads. His voice faltered for the first time, and Emma realized how difficult the admission was for him. Maybe that's because I stopped believing in myths a long time ago, she said. All I see is someone trying too hard to save something already broken. He gave a quiet laugh, the sound full of defeat and admiration. You're not wrong, he said, but sometimes saving what's broken is all that's left of love. The words slipped out before he could catch them, and both of them froze, aware that something irrevocable had passed between them. The moment stretched heavy and electric. Outside, clouds began to gather again, the city dimming as if the weather itself had leaned in to listen. Emma felt the world narrow to the sound of her heartbeat and the steady rhythm of his breathing. Jackson, she whispered, unsure what she was asking. He stepped closer, stopping just short of touching her. You shouldn't look at me like that, he said. It makes me forget the lines I promised myself never to cross. Her pulse quickened. Maybe some lines need to be crossed, she said, the words trembling out before she could think. Jackson closed his eyes briefly, as if steadying himself against the gravity of her voice. When he opened them again, the distance between them vanished. Not through touch, but through something deeper, an invisible current that connected one wounded heart to another. I used to think emotion was weakness, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's what my father taught me. But when you look at me, I start to believe the opposite. That maybe feeling something real is the only thing that makes us human. Emma felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Then stop running from it, she said. You've spent your life trying to quantify what can't be measured. Maybe the answer was never in the data. Jackson's hand came up, hovering near her face, hesitating as if touching her might shatter the fragile honesty between them. You don't understand what it costs to care for me, he said. Every person who's tried has paid for it. Then let me decide if it's worth it, she replied. The conviction in her tone startled even her. He looked at her for a long moment, and then, very slowly, he lowered his hand. You already have, he said quietly. The sound of thunder rolled again outside, breaking the spell. Jackson turned away first, walking to the window, his shoulders tight with restraint. There's something coming, he said after a pause. Something that could end everything my father built. And maybe that's for the best. But I won't let it destroy you. Emma's voice was soft but firm. I don't want protection, she said. I want truth. He turned back to her, the faintest smile ghosting across his lips. Then you'll have it. But once you know, there's no going back. I stopped wanting to go back the moment I met you, she said, and the simplicity of it landed between them like a vow. For the rest of the day they spoke little, yet everything in the air had changed. The tension was no longer a quiet threat, but a promise waiting to unfold. Emma caught glimpses of him through glass walls and conference reflections. The man who had once seemed untouchable now burdened with a vulnerability he could no longer hide. She realized she had crossed the invisible boundary between employee and confidant, between curiosity and something far more dangerous, belief. When night finally fell, she remained at her desk long after everyone else had gone, her fingers motionless on the keyboard as the city lights blinked to life outside. Somewhere above, she knew Jackson was still awake, pacing in his office, fighting the same war between reason and feeling that now consumed her. And though they were separated by walls of glass and silence, she felt his presence as if he stood beside her, the echo of a heartbeat that refused to fade. The storm outside had not stopped since dawn. The rain came in sheets that blurred the forest into a gray curtain, and thunder rolled through the mountains like a heartbeat that refused to quiet. Inside the cabin, Emma sat at the long wooden table, her eyes following the droplets sliding down the fogged window pane, each one catching the faint light of the hearth behind her. Jackson had been gone since early morning. He had walked into the forest before sunrise, saying nothing, carrying that old rifle on his back in a silence that felt like a farewell. Every hour he stayed away fed a slow panic in her chest. The wind pressed against the windows, the fire hissed low, and in that loneliness she realized how much of her strength now depended on his return. She rose, paced the cabin, her steps echoing against the floorboards. The place was starting to feel smaller, the air thicker, as if the walls themselves were waiting with her. Jackson's coat still hung by the door, damp and smelling faintly of pine and smoke, and she found herself tracing the edge of the fabric with her fingers, feeling the ghost of warmth it once held. Memories of his voice, gruff, deep, sometimes cold but never unkind, ran through her head in loops. She could almost hear him again saying, "Don't follow me into the woods. Not today." Yet the more she thought about it, the more impossible those words became to obey. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones, that strange intuitive pull that had guided her steps since she met him. The forest had always frightened her, not for its darkness but for the sense of watching eyes, the quiet intelligence in its silence. Still, she stepped out into it now, her boots sinking into mud, her hair whipped by rain. Every sound, the snap of branches, the moan of wind through wet leaves, felt amplified, as if the forest itself wanted to tell her something. She followed the faint trail Jackson had taken, through the mist and the tall dripping trees that bowed under the weight of water. After half an hour she saw it, footprints that stopped abruptly at the edge of a clearing. There the rain had washed away all signs of movement except for one thing, a torn piece of fabric snagged on a root, dark red and unmistakably his. Her breath caught. The clearing was strange. The ground dipped slightly, and in the center stood an old stone structure half swallowed by vines, a ruin of some kind, circular, with carvings that pulsed faintly as if reacting to her presence. She stepped closer despite herself. The air shimmered faintly, and she felt that same hum she'd felt around Jackson before, that subtle vibration that lived beneath the skin of the world. Then she heard it, his voice low and strained, echoing from somewhere beyond the stone. She ran, slipping on the wet moss, calling his name, until she found him kneeling beside the ruin, his hands pressed to the earth as if he were trying to calm something that was alive beneath it. When he looked up at her, the rain streamed down his face, but his eyes burned with a light that wasn't human. "You weren't supposed to come," he said, voice breaking. "Emma, you shouldn't be here." But it was too late. She could see it now, the faint glow under his skin, the pulse that matched the storm's rhythm. The truth that had haunted her was no longer hidden. He stood, and when the lightning tore across the sky, it illuminated what he truly was. Not entirely human, not entirely other, something that lived between worlds. The forest seemed to respond to him. The trees bent inward, the rain slowed as if held in suspension, and the earth itself exhaled. Emma didn't move. She couldn't. Fear mingled with awe, her heart pounding in her ears. "You were never just a man," she whispered. He took a step toward her, and though his body trembled, there was no menace in him, only exhaustion. "I was," he said quietly once, "until they found me. Until I became what I had to be to protect what they wanted to destroy." His eyes flickered, light blue, then silver, then something that looked like lightning caught in glass. He reached for her hand but stopped short, afraid his touch might hurt her. "You think I saved you," he said, voice raw, "but you were never the one who needed saving. It was me.